Here's a look at the latest ensemble member runs from the GFS model, and it looks very concerning because we have multiple ensemble members now wanting to take a strong tropical storm making landfall somewhere along the coast of southern Canada, and we even have a couple of ensemble members wanting to take this as far west as the United States, where the New England could experience impacts. But we're definitely going to need to take a look at several factors before we can assume that this will bring major impacts along the coast of Florida. We're definitely going to need to watch out for how much ridging there will be just to the north of this storm, because the stronger amount of ridging there will be and the stronger of a negative tilt we'll see between this low pressure system over the northeast as well as this ridge located over the northern Atlantic will be key in determining how far west or east this will move, and of course the strength will play a big role as well. Here's the current water vapor imagery for Tropical Storm Cindy, and you see it's currently moving slightly to the northwest. The northwest at around 10 miles per hour, but you clearly see that there's a strong amount of wind shear over this storm system right now, where we do see that the outflow clouds are drifting straight towards the east, as there's a small upper level low that's located just to the northwest, just to the northeast of Puerto Rico. That's bringing currently a strong amount of wind shear, so it's going to struggle to maintain its strength over the next several days thanks to the strong upper level flow we're seeing, where the upper level winds are hovering around 30 knots, which is enough to completely disintegrate the center of circulation and pretty much diverge a lot of that energy away from the center of circulation and further eastward. And if that energy is a little bit too spread out, or if the air molecules are diverted away from the center of circulation, that will weaken the storm, because that would mean that less convergence will occur around the center of circulation, which means that there's going to be less warm air, less of an upward motion in the atmosphere, and that would allow the pressure to stabilize and increase along the surface for the wind speed to increase. So this storm system is going to struggle over the next several days, and in fact it is expected that it will fall below tropical depression status, but there is a possibility that once this approaches around the latitude of North Carolina and a little bit further northward, the wind shear could die down to the point where we could see the storm system re-strengthen as it approaches Canada. Here's a wind shear map over the northern Atlantic at this time, and we clearly do see that this storm system is dealing with a strong amount of wind shear, hovering around 40 to even 50 knots in some areas of this storm. So this is definitely helping disintegrate and weaken this storm as it continues to head further northwestward. But I want you guys to take a look just a little bit further northward. We see that the wind shear becomes rather light, where the upper level winds are hovering more around 5 to 10 knots rather than the 40 to 50 knots per hour readings that we're seeing right over this storm. So that will definitely help potentially re-strengthen this storm as it continues to head further northward in the more long-term future. Here's a look at the latest run of the GFS model, and the GFS model is taking a fairly concerning forecast when it comes to Tropical Storm Cindy, because right after it weakens to, let's say, maybe a weak tropical storm or a tropical depression, the GFS model expects the storm to rapidly intensify once it approaches the latitude of, let's say, Bermuda and South Carolina, where we see the pressure drop down to the 980s, and that's equivalent to possibly a Category 1 hurricane right just to the east of Bermuda. But like I've been saying with a lot of my previous videos when it comes to tropical cyclone development in the month of June, the GFS model tends to be a little bit too aggressive in strengthening tropical cyclones, especially during the early part of the hurricane season. So we definitely need to take this with a bigger grain of salt. But the European model also expects some sort of re-strengthening to surface as this approaches Canada, where we do see that the European model also wants to lower the pressure just before it makes landfall. And for the GFS model's case, we see the pressure drop down to 979 millibars, and the sea surf temperatures are hovering just around 80 or just below 80 around this area. So while it would make it more difficult if the sea surf temperatures are hovering, let's say, around the mid to upper 70s, it isn't entirely impossible that a tropical storm could intensify over waters that are slightly cooler than 80 degrees. It will definitely need some baroclinic influences, and the dynamics of this storm will definitely need to be built different for this to strengthen over sea surf temperatures that are below 80 degrees, but this could certainly still maintain its strength before it reaches Canada. But by the time it moves north of the Gulf Stream, that's when the sea surf temperatures really take a nosedive, where the sea surf temperatures hover more around the 60s and 50s, and that's when you would expect rapid weakening with this storm as it approaches Canada, where we do see the pressure drop significantly down to the upper 990s, but there's still a strong tropical storm making landfall right around the southern coast of Canada, and this isn't very far from Maine either. So if this were to move a little bit further westward, which is certainly still in the realm of possibilities, this could potentially bring some impacts right up along the New England coast as we approach the weekend of July 4th. So this is definitely something we're going to need to pay close attention to, and this may not be considered a fantasy storm, because look at the forecast hour I'm going at. While yes, there's still a lot of days to iron out the forecast between now and Saturday, July 1st, it isn't so far out to the point where we won't take it seriously at all, because it's still within the 7 to 6 day time period for computer models to have at least a better idea of what's to come in the near future. So we're definitely going to at least need to be aware of this storm over the next several days, since the GFS model and even the European model wants to re-intensify this just before it makes landfall somewhere around Canada. Here's the European model's forecast when it comes to this storm, and while the European model is very similar to what the GFS model is stating when it comes to the exact trajectory, it isn't similar when it comes to the strength, because the European model is taking a much weaker storm. If we were to move forward in the more short-term future, we do see that the European model expects the storm to maintain a weak tropical storm status as it moves northward, before eventually weakening into just a regular low pressure system by the time this approaches Bermuda. But in the more long-term future, that's when Canada could see re-intensification of this storm, where we do see that this storm could be intensified to something that's around tropical storm status. This might not be considered fully a tropical storm by the time it's this far up northward, because that's when the sea surf temperatures do take a nosedive quickly, where sea surf temperatures drop dramatically 10 to 20 degrees compared to what it was experiencing just south of the jet stream. But it still could at least bring tropical storm force impacts along the Canadian coast if this were to come for fruition. And it's a very similar forecast and timing to what the GFS model is stating. So the chance that this storm system, whether it's a tropical storm or a depression or just a regular low pressure system in general, the chance that this goes out to sea, I'll say, are definitely more slim, because the European and the GFS model are forecasting that there's going to be a strong amount of ridging over this storm and a low pressure system right over the northeast that's going to at least want to steer this storm towards land, as it's very unlikely it's going to find its way out to sea and not impact anybody. So the southern Canadian coast and even New England, you should at least be aware of this possibility, because a lot could change between now and 7 days, but I'll say it's more likely than not this will at least make landfall somewhere around Canada and potentially the United States. But the strength will be the main key when it comes to this forecast, because if this is just a weak low pressure system, then there won't be much to worry about, but this could potentially be a strong tropical storm, so you at least need to be aware of that possibility, and the strength forecast will be huge. So here are the primary steering flows when it comes to Tropical Storm Cindy, and moving forward with the forecast, we do see that we're going to see a strong ridge that's going to be located just to the east of the northeast. That's going to block this storm from being able to have an open area to where the jet stream could pick it up and move it out to sea, which is what we typically see for tropical storms that move this far up north. But in this case, we see a very strong ridge. So Cindy really has nowhere to go but straight towards land, whether it's in southern Canada or right up along the New England coast. And another thing too is that we see a low pressure system located over the northeast at right around the same time period by next week. Now, the key thing that will determine how far west or east this storm will move is, of course, how strong will this low pressure system be? Because if this low pressure system is a lot more stronger than anticipated, then we should see a much more significant negative tilt with the jet stream, where the jet stream winds will shift more from a southeasterly direction, and that would make the storm take a little bit more of a left hook that would steer it towards New England and potentially bring more impacts to the United States. However, if this low pressure system were weaker than anticipated, while it's still certainly more likely to still impact land anyways somewhere around southern Canada, it wouldn't move as far west, so the United States would miss out on more impacts if this low pressure system were a little bit weaker. Right now, the GFS model expects the low pressure system to be just strong enough to where it'll take a slight shift to where it'll move a little bit further westward, and we do see that this ridge will continue to block this storm, and of course the southern side of a ridge in the northern hemisphere moves from east, has winds that moves from a easterly direction, so that would steer the storm a little bit further westward and make it take a little bit of a left hook before it makes landfall. And this low pressure system will help in that, because the northwest side of a low pressure system has winds that come from the east, so that will help to steer the storm a little bit further eastward. So this could bring impacts to Canada. So depending on how strong this ridge as well as this low will be, the stronger those two will be, the more likely we're going to see this take a left hook. But the weaker those two will be, the more likely we'll see this storm pretty much move straight up north, impacting southern Canada. So we're definitely going to need to pay close attention to these two factors by the time we approach next week. Now, in terms of the strength forecast, which I believe in this scenario is more important, since it's likely that whatever is left of Cindy will make landfall, but the big question is how strong will it be once it makes landfall. So if we were to take a look at the wind shear map, it does have me a little bit concerned, because of course, while we do see a strong amount of wind shear over this storm for now, we do see that this storm will eventually head into an environment where the wind shear is fairly light, which is very rare for an area to be this slightly sheared during the month of June, especially this far up northward. But we do see a pretty open area where the wind shear is light, so this could have an open area to where it could intensify, and that's exactly what the GFS model does. And while the wind shear does increase once this moves further northward, and of course the sea surf temperatures will decrease significantly by the time this approaches the latitude of the northeast, it might not be entirely enough, because this storm strengthens so much already over the warmer waters and the lightly sheared environment that even though it will weaken by the time it approaches the northeast, it'll still have plenty of strength with it. And plus, even though the upper level winds would be very strong over this storm by the time we approach Friday, June 30th, the thing is that the upper level winds will move the same direction at which the lower level winds are moving. So this would help, if anything, intensify the storms, especially on the eastern side, rather than completely break it apart, because the wind flow along the lower levels and the upper levels are moving the exact same direction. So it's less likely to interfere with the air molecules spiraling around the center of circulation, and only enhance the wind speed along the eastern side. So even though though the upper level winds are quite strong, I don't think it's necessarily going to be enough to potentially completely weaken this storm, because the upper level winds will move the same direction as the lower level winds. So that's at least something to keep in mind. But the sea surf temperatures will of course weaken it, and it's still unknown if it'll be this strong by the time it approaches Canada, because of course the European model is in high disagreement. So the key thing is that we're going to need to pay close attention to is how much will this storm weaken over the next 2 to 3 days, because if it completely dissipates, then that would definitely enhance the possibility that Canada will just experience a regular low pressure system and not much of anything to worry about when it comes to the remnants of Cindy. But if this storm is at least able to maintain a little bit of strength or organization despite the strong wind shear it's experiencing right now, then that would be concerning, because it'll be over a lightly sheared environment. It'll still have the eye wall to rapidly intensify, unlike a completely dissipated low pressure system, because if the low pressure system becomes completely dissipated, then it's going to take a while for it to develop another eye wall, another closed center circulation, and it won't have a lot of time to do that because the wind shear will increase significantly and the cold waters aren't very far away from this storm. So the next 2 days I think will be key in determining the future of this storm and how strong it'll be once it impacts Canada, because if it maintains its closed center circulation, then we could see a pretty rapidly intensifying storm by the time this approaches the northern Atlantic, which would definitely be a major concern. The European model is also expecting a very similar forecast when it comes to wind shear, but the European model expects the storm to completely dissipate, so that will definitely inhibit this storm from being able to make landfall as a concerning threat, because if this storm were to completely dissipate, the closed center circulation wouldn't be there, so it'll need to have more time to develop that center of circulation. But it might be too late by the time it does, because the wind shear greatly increases and the cold water, and it'll be over cold waters by the time it could redevelop any sort of closed center circulation, which is the reason why the European model expects primarily a very weak low pressure system to make landfall somewhere along southern Canada. But we're definitely going to need to pay close attention over the next 48 hours to see how strong this storm will be and if it will maintain its strength. Here are the current sea surf temperatures over the northern Atlantic at this time, and we do see that once this approaches the latitude of Bermuda, that's when we should see the sea surf temperatures drop below 80 degrees, where they're hovering around 24 or 23 degrees Celsius, and then sharply drop by the time it moves just north of the jet stream, which is right around the latitude of New York City by this time. However, we're definitely gonna, it still could strengthen despite the sea surf temperatures hovering more around the mid to upper 70s, so it still should at least maintain its strength before it rapidly weakens before it makes landfall along Canada. So keep that in mind with this forecast as well. It just won't strengthen as much as it could, let's say, if it were August, because sea surf temperatures are below 80 degrees in this small area. So here's my forecast when it comes to a potential tropical storm Cindy, which could potentially make landfall somewhere along southern Canada. So there's still a lot of time to iron out the forecast. Like I said, the next 48 hours will be key. If it's able to maintain a closed center circulation, then it could have an open area to intensify to something more concerning. So southern Canada and New England definitely need to be aware of this scenario, and I'll keep you guys updated over the next several days. But thank you guys for watching, and make sure to subscribe for more updates.